Yo, what is good, people? Ben from Lover of Tech, and we are back with another video. This time, camera comparison between the iPhone 14 Pro versus the previous iPhone 13 Pro. And we're pretty much going to see, with the improvements to all the hardware and the software, as well as the internals, how is the camera going to really fare up. So we're going to test it in low light and daylight for videos and photos, and we're starting with the selfie camera. Yeah, this is going to be a very interesting camera comparison. Let's do a quick breakdown of the camera hardware specs on both these devices. And with the iPhone 14 Pro, you do have a new 48 megapixel sensor for the main wide sensor. The ultra wide at 12 megapixel has been improved, and you do have a 3x 12 megapixel sensor for the zoom as well. The selfie also has been improved at 12 megapixels. Moving over to the iPhone 13 Pro, it is using three 12 megapixel sensors at the back for the wide, ultra wide, and the zoom, as well as the 12 megapixel for the selfie. Highly recommend that you watch this in the highest resolution as possible in 4K, as well as with headphones on. There will be chapters in the description all over the video as well, but I highly recommend you sit back, get a meal, get your popcorn, get your drink, watch it all the way through, and refer back using the chapters when you want to at another time. With that out of the way, let's get into the main camera comparison. So we are starting off in 4K UHD 60 frames a second on a selfie camera, and we're pretty much just seeing how the image quality, dynamic range, and stabilization is like. Quick run. So we've now dropped down to the 4K UHD 30 frames a second on the front-facing camera, seeing if there's a change in the dynamic range, image quality, as well as the stabilization. Quick run. So we are now shooting in the cinematic video mode, the portrait video mode. On the iPhone 14 Pro, it has been upgraded to 4K UHD 30 frames a second. There is a 24 frames a second option, but that is only available in 4K. You can still shoot in 1080p, but that only is available in 30 frames a second. And the iPhone 13 Pro is limited to 30 frames a second at 1080p. Let's see how the background blur, the edge detection, and the stabilization is like. So we are now in the rear video camera shooting mode, 4K 30 frames a second on both cameras. And again, just seeing how the image quality, stabilization, dynamic range is like. Take a quick run. Let's switch to the ultra wide. Again, you can do this seamlessly, and it should be a smooth zoom transition on the 14 Pro. Quick run. We're gonna 2x crop, which is on the main 48 megapixel sensor. It's more of a center crop. 2x digital on the 13 Pro. Just seeing how the stabilization handles. I'm going to switch to the 3x zoom. You'll see a slight pop. Back to the main. Now, another thing to just bear in mind is on an iPhone, you still can't pause recording and continue recording on the same clip. And unfortunately, you still can't flip to the selfie camera while still recording on the same clip. It's still something that's a limitation on iPhones I would really love to be addressed, especially with how great the image quality is. One of the new video shooting modes on here with the iPhone 14 Pro is action mode. And what this does is it generates a super sophisticated advanced stabilization up to 2.8K and at 24 frames, 30 frames, and 60 frames a second. We're in 30 frames a second now, is the filter to the ultra wide. We're on the ultra wide for the iPhone 13 Pro, sorry. That doesn't have any mode like this. So we're gonna take a serious run and see how that looks like. Still in the action mode on iPhone 14 Pro, but we've switched it to the main camera lens, the main 48 megapixel sensor, and we've done the same for the iPhone 13 Pro. Still at 30 frames a second for now, but just remember it does do this at 60 frames a second as well. An extreme one to see how the stabilization is like. So we are now in the 4K 60 frames a second video recording mode on the main wide sensor on both. We still can't seamlessly switch between the rear lenses when recording in 4K UHD 60 frames a second. It's something you do have to pause and switch lens and then continue specifically for 4K 60 frames a second. Let's take a quick run. So switching to the ultra wide 4K UHD 60 frames a second, seeing if there's any improvements in this mode. Quick run. So 4K 30 frames a second on the rear camera with the main wide sensor, ultra wide on this one, sorry, the ultra wide sensor on this one. Just seeing how it looks and behaves with me in the frame as a subject. We've now switched to the main wide sensor, the main 48 megapixel sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro and the main 12 megapixel sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro. Now we're now shooting in the cinematic video portrait mode on the rear cameras, main wide sensor, and again, iPhone 14 Pro is in 4K 30 frames a second, while the 13 Pro is limited to 1080p 30. So this is the low light video test in 4K 30 frames a second on the iPhone 13 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro. Just seeing how the low light performance is like between the two. We're now going to switch to the ultra wide and see if we've got any improvements in the low light. And so far it does look like it, but we will reserve judgment once we test and look at the footage. We're going to go back to the main camera. I wouldn't usually recommend this, but we're going to go to the 2x because this is cropping into the 12 megapixel sensor of the 48 megapixel main sensor. 2x on the iPhone 13 Pro. We're just going to do a slow walk in this situation. We're going to switch to the 3x zoom. Potentially this is still cropping in on the main sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro, so just bear that in mind. And now back to the main sensor. We are now in the 4K 30 frames a second selfie mode in low light, just seeing how they perform. Let's kick things off starting with the daytime landscape scenery images. Looking at the ultra wide, I honestly could not tell the difference between the two. with potentially only difference that I'm seeing here being a slightly more vibrant look to the sky on the iPhone 13 Pro and a slightly more detailed image when it comes to the iPhone 14 Pro. Moving over to the wide sensor, you can tell ever so slightly that the 14 Pro does have a slightly wider field of view and a more neutral, cooler color temperature compared to the 13 Pro. Quad pixel or not, both are producing good detailed images here. I then tried the 2x sensor crop mode on the iPhone 14 Pro's 48 megapixel sensor versus the 2x digital zoom on the 13 Pro, and here you can definitely see differences in detail, sharpness and clarity favoring the 14 Pro. The 3x zoom sees slightly warmer colors on the 14 Pro this time around. Both look near enough the same in terms of the sharpness, detail and clarity. Continuing with the landscape images in this Bose field, when looking at the ultra wide, there is a decent amount to take in here. The iPhone 13 Pro is definitely producing a warmer and more vibrant overall image, and by a small margin handles direct sound control better. The iPhone 14 Pro, on the other hand, maintains a more neutral color temperature, sacrifices a little bit more HDR control on the sun in favor of better shadow details. This carries over to be near enough the same for the main wide sensor for both phones, and in some ways the more vibrant look of the images from the 13 Pro might be preferred as it gives off that punchy look compared to the more neutral, even look of the 14 Pro. The 2x zoom mode for both cameras carry the same results as previous, with the exception of more detail and clarity on the 14 Pro. The 3x zoom is another interesting one. Clarity and detail looks to be the same on both, but the differences are the HDR, which looks worse on the 14 Pro for some reason compared to the 13 Pro, and the color temperature on the 14 Pro having a much cooler and more neutral look. In the maximum extended zoom at 15x, not by a clear amount, but the iPhone 14 Pro does have better image processing when using digital zoom. The shot of the flower on the main wide sensor mostly illustrates the minimum focusing distance of both these phones, with the 13 Pro being able to get closer. With the macro mode active, I was more confident and able to get closer to the flower with the 14 Pro. Let's move over to the selfie, and in the standard mode without portrait mode active, it's very hard to tell the difference between the two. The only thing I can really say here is potentially the 14 Pro does a slightly better job managing my skin tones in this situation. For portrait mode, in terms of the image quality, both rendered the same results as previously mentioned, with the iPhone 14 Pro having slightly better edge detection. Last of the daylight images using the rear cameras with me as a subject, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. I can potentially pick slightly more detail on the 14 Pro, but at this point, it's really pixel peeping. The wide sensor though is all in the fine details, with the 14 Pro really showing that. The 13 Pro holds its own very well, and it's honest, really not that far behind. When comparing the 2x mode, the iPhone 14 does retain more detail and clarity. Looking at the portrait mode in the 1x mode, it's safe to say that both perform basically the same in terms of the edge detection and blur. One advantage with the iPhone 14 Pro is that you do have the option for the 2x zoom mode for the portrait mode, and I have to say I really like the results here, and it may be my preferred focal length. And the last one to close off for the daytime images is the 3x portrait mode, which yet again pretty much looks the same on both. Let's move over to the low light images, starting off with the landscape shots. The wide sensor in this case favors the 14 Pro with a cleaner image, less lens flaring from the street light and slightly less noise, but the 13 Pro is not far behind. In the 3x zoom mode, the 14 Pro holds a better image. In this super extreme low light situation, although not suitable on both phones, the 14 Pro's ultra wide is less noisy compared to the 13 Pro. Both the main wide sensor and the 3x zoom overall struggle the same on both. Night mode is where the real difference maker is, with just the ultra wide not only performing well, but the main wide sensor, which really shows improvement on the 14 Pro with a better final image. This shot of the flower here with the main sensor using night mode came out to be near enough the same on both, with the iPhone 14 Pro having slightly warmer color tones. When analyzing the low light selfie images, I captured in the standard mode, then in night mode, then with the front screen flash. Mind you, there is still the issue of not being able to use night mode and portrait mode together on the selfie on both phones. I was expecting better results from the 14 Pro in this situation, and it's going to be a bit of a hot take, but I do prefer the results I'm seeing across the board on the 13 Pro. Let's close things off with the last set of nighttime images with me as the subject. The first 4 images are without night mode active from the ultra wide, the main sensor, 2x zoom and 3x zoom. And apart from a more balanced color temperature on the 14 Pro, the difference, even when pixel peeping, is very minimal. Night mode cleans up the image well on both the ultra wide and the wide sensor on both devices. What really impressed me was the flashlight performance on the 14 Pro. This is something I usually don't focus on, but with the improved flash module on the 14 Pro, I was curious to see the results, and I have to say, I'm very impressed and actually gives me more confidence to start using flash in low light again. Night mode on the 1x view in portrait mode on the 14 Pro performs better with edge detection and a slightly more detailed image. Let's summarize the video performance, and I have to say this is where the difference in improvement starts to show. Although you still get a drop in dynamic range when shooting in 4K 60 frames per second compared to 4K 30 frames per second on a selfie camera, this seems to be less of an issue on the iPhone 14 Pro compared to the 13 Pro, which is something I am very happy to see. The overall video stabilization is improved on the iPhone 14 Pro, but the best improvement has got to be the video portrait mode. It's not just the fact that you can shoot in 4K 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, but the edge detection seems to work better while offering solid stabilization. And I personally think this shooting mode for the 14 Pro is a game changer. Moving over to the rear cameras, 2 immediate things I noticed when analyzing the footage. There's even smoother transitions when switching between each lens when shooting in a mode that allows you like 4K 30 frames a second. The iPhone 13 Pro was already some of the smoothest, but the 14 Pro is just that bit better. Next is the overall video stabilization, which looks better on the 14 Pro. Next also is Apple's new action mode, which shoots in exactly the resolution of 2816 by 1584 at 24 frames, 30 frames and 60 frames. The image is softer compared to the normal 4K mode on the 13 Pro, and it does need a lot of light to work properly, but the difference in stabilization is amazing compared to the competition, and Apple are just far ahead when it comes to the video quality here. What I also liked was the more natural blur of the main sensor on the 14 Pro when I was in a frame as a subject, and of course the 4K cinematic mode on the 14 Pro rear camera just looks so good, offering better image quality, edge detection and video stabilization. What surprised me even more was just how much better the low light video was for the main sensor on the iPhone 14 Pro and even on the ultra wide. Now, I still wouldn't recommend using the ultra wide and low light for video, but the improvement is definitely a bigger one than I expected comparing it to the 13 Pro. Microphone audio quality to my ears is pretty much the same on both phones, saying that they are still very good. That is it with this ultimate camera comparison between the iPhone 14 Pro and the 13 Pro. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. That's it for me, Ben from Lover of Tech. If you enjoy videos like this, you know exactly what to do. Hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you're part of Team TLS, the Tech Lover Squad, so you don't miss any future videos on the channel. I hope you're all safe during this time. I will catch you in the next one. Peace.